All right, it's 1:30 Eastern time, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to those of you who have joined. This is a particularly exciting conversation for me to present this afternoon because honestly, prior to my tenure at CyberSane, I never really had thought about the concepts of centralizing risk operations in the way that I'm going to discuss in this chat today. A lot of that has to do with functionality that's been developed around CyberSane's mission of centralizing, standardizing, and automating the cyber risk business function. So I'm going to walk through some of the concepts around that today and discuss some sort of future focused initiatives for ways that we can do better in the future to centralize risk operations and to prepare ourselves for the future of cybersecurity. So I'm going to start out here just by introducing myself. My name is, again, Steve Trino. I'm the VP of Solution Architecture here at CyberSane. I've been in CyberSane for about 3 years now. My background, I've worked in a variety of roles in IT and information security, both on the practitioner side as well as on the service provider side. So I have kind of a broad background, seen a lot of different areas of cybersecurity, and I think I bring kind of a generalist approach to my role here at CyberSane. In my day-to-day activities here, I work with a lot of our customers, both large and small, in terms of implementation, both in the pre-sales process as well as in the post-sales and implementation process. So we'll be kind of sprinkling some of my experience working with customers in terms of how they've operationalized, standardizing, and centralizing and automating cybersecurity, leveraging the platform here today. Just to go over a brief agenda of what we'll cover, I'm going to go through a little bit of history and some problem statement to kind of just discuss the reason why we got to where we've gotten today and the solution that we've put together to kind of solve that through continuous control automation. I'm then going to get into in discussing how in solving one problem, we've sort of potentially created another. And then that's going to get us into the bulk of the conversation around what we're evangelizing as the concept of a risk operation center. We'll talk a little bit about what it is, how it differentiates from a security operations center, and some thoughts on how to operationalize that. Finally, at the end, I'll give some closing thoughts and also present an invitation for a document that we've put together here at CyberSane called the ROC Implementation Guide for anyone who's interested in reading a little bit more about these types of concepts. So a little bit about the history. I have some bullets here to kind of guide the conversation, but if you go back and look at cybersecurity in general, one of the main challenges that we've been presented with is it's often treated as a siloed business process, right? Which presents us with a lack of visibility and a lack of transparency. I think that's evident in a lot of different ways, starting from if you went back, 15, 20 years, the concept of good cyber hygiene being protecting the perimeter, right? Obviously, that didn't last too long because by these days, the perimeter is essentially everywhere. We all carry around smartphones in our pockets, whether they're BYOD devices or corporate devices that are given to us by our employer. The perimeter is basically everywhere, and the lengths that we've had to go through to protect it, have obviously expanded significantly. That also exists in the context, though, of an environment where the technical tools that we have to protect ourselves are getting better and better all the time. There's so many of them. We see them, introduced every year at all the big conferences. Really amazing technology. But overall, if you look at a macro level, it's done almost nothing to minimize or prevent the frequency of occurrence of cyber events. And what that kind of leads me to believe is that the problem has a lot more to do with people and process than it does with just simply technology. That's kind of more from a technical perspective there. But overall, the cyber risk management process is also not immune to this kind of siloed situation here as well. We oftentimes manage that within an IT function instead of more broadly within the organization, even though it really is a multifunctional business process that touches all different areas within the organization. One of the challenges up to this day really is that it's lacked a system of record, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. If we compare cyber to any other cross-functional business process that touches different areas of the organization, they all have a system of record, right? Whether it's finance and general ledger, or whether it's sales and CRM, or ERM platforms. It's kind of crazy that we're still, for the most part, managing our cybersecurity process out of spreadsheets, right? And GRC has been the default or the de facto way that we've looked towards implementing a system of record to manage the process. The challenge has been that it's kind of been bolted on as an afterthought. It wasn't really one of the problems that GRC was intended to solve kind of from the beginning. And so although it has certain use cases that are beneficial. Overall, it hasn't really solved the problem, and that's really indicated by the fact that most people are still to this day managing this process through spreadsheets. So whether that's the assessment process, whether it's running risk registers, whether it's trying to organize assessments, all that tends to be done in human error prone ways, right? So sending spreadsheets around isn't great for version control. Sometimes there's issues with versioning in terms of like what uh, is it version 1.0 that we're on, or is it version 2.0? Maybe we're on 2.0, but somebody only has a spreadsheet for version 1.0, and so they're responding to those questions. What do they do with the artifacts? Where do they put that kind of evidence together? So really kind of disjointed process overall, which leads to a lack of standardization. And then overall, what this all contributes to is probably the biggest problem, which is a real difficult time translating cyber risk into business terms. Um, One of the things that we really have not done a great job historically in the industry here of doing is presenting concepts around cyber risk in terminology that business stakeholders are used to understanding. So frequently we kind of default to more technical terminology, bits and bytes, or SQL injection or buffer overflow, and that's not really helpful. Business stakeholders are accustomed to hearing about risk. They hear about risk all the time, whether it's the risk of a natural disaster or a pandemic these days, or an active shooter, or whatever the risk to an organization might be. They're accustomed to hearing concepts around things like likelihood and impact. They're not really accustomed to hearing some of the more technical terminology. And that to solve some of that, CyberSaint, with our CyberStrong flagship offering, has standardized on the NIST CSF to kind of like try and help leverage some of the concepts that NIST provides out of the box, with terminology like identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, just words that are easier for individuals who may not be experts in cybersecurity or cyber risk management to understand. And that as we do that more and more, and as we speak their language more, that really helps us quite a bit in terms of gathering the resources that we need. Overall, cybersecurity really is a business problem. And as we look at maturing our processes across the board, we need to be making sure that we're ingraining that into culture, that we're making sure our programs are adequately resourced. And none of that can really happen if we're not speaking the language of the business. That also goes to quantifying risk, which we'll talk a little bit later in this presentation here. There's a difference between saying there's a risk that availability at this processing site would be impacted and we expect the impact to be high, versus saying, hey, we did some calculations here, and if this plant goes down, we're going to lose $1 million a day. Those have very different responses from other business leaders. So the extent to which we can speak kind of more in their language, we're kind of helping everybody out here. So condensing that all down into just a sentence here to create a problem statement. With status quo approaches to managing cyber risk, organizations are unable to understand or respond to risk in real time using quantitative methods that translate cyber risk into business risk. So now let me talk a little bit about the solution here. And I'm going to start not from left to right. I'm actually going to start right here in the middle. The way that we've approached solving this problem really starts with an understanding of controls. Now, what does controls mean? It can be anything from a common control framework, which might be something that an organization develops themselves, something that's homegrown. It could be a combination of controls from best practices frameworks, maybe frameworks that have to do with your own individual compliance requirements. So maybe you're taking trust services criteria controls from the AICPA for your SOC 2 and HIPAA controls or PCI controls, maybe rounding that out with some of the best practices that come from NIST 853. But we try to be agnostic, so it could also be something like the informative references to the CSF. It could just be the subcategories to the CSF itself. Whatever those statements are going to be that we are evaluating ourselves on a scale of either yes or no, pass or fail, NIST implementation tier, C2, M2, doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we have certain statements and outcomes that we need to evaluate ourselves on at some frequency and determine whether we are in compliance with those or not. So that's why we have the pass-fail there underneath each of these controls. Then simultaneously and alongside it, we have a register of what our risks are in the organization. Each of those risks is associated with a control profile. So what that allows you to do is measure over time how effective your risk mitigation has been based on control performance. It also enables things like if a control that impacts a risk were to fall out of compliance for some reason, that can generate notifications to the appropriate system owners or control owners. It's also going to roll itself up into dashboarding, right? So maybe leaders or executive users who might not be too interested in the bits and bytes of how we got there. They just want to know kind of how we stand, similar to how they might look at a general ledger software solution or a CRM to see about what sales are looking like in the next quarter. Just a high level picture. All of that kind of updates in real time based on control performance. Now, where the really interesting part comes in, though, is over here to the left, where you see a bunch of vendor names over there. If you think about the traditional way of scoring controls, somebody, a system owner or control owner, is going to evaluate a statement in terms of pass or fail, yes or no, and they're going to generate evidence or artifacts to support that position, frequently, at least for technical controls, through configuration settings, screenshots, etc., from different technology systems within the stack that support that particular controls function. So if you think of identity and access management, maybe we're looking at domain controllers, your Active Directories, things like that. If it's vulnerability scanners, maybe we're pulling scan results out of Qualys or Tenable or something similar. Cloud security controls may be coming directly from the CSPs themselves with their native services like Azure Security Center, AWS Config. At CyberSync, we have taken the approach that although not all controls can be automated completely, obviously there's a human component that goes into a lot of controls, certainly anything related to policies and procedures, things like that. But the technical ones, why not take some of that human intervention out of the picture here? So we're able to ingest telemetry from a variety of different sources and associate that directly into the controls. That can be via an API. It can also be through, for example, Snowflake, the data warehouse. We can use that as a single point of ingestion and bring it in that way. There's also ways to just ingest manual files and things like that, but the ingestion doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we're able to take telemetry that is associated with controls, apply business logic to it, right? So we're understanding the context. Take a vulnerability scan, for example. If you run a scan and there's one critical vulnerability, does that mean that a control fails or not? Do you need 100? Is it, how are you defining that? But anyway, by taking telemetry, running that through a business logic engine, and then associating that with controls, we can, in a more real-time way, view our risk posture based on the control profiles that are associated with that particular risk, and understand in real time how these changes are impacting our systems and overall how it's impacting our risk. So a pretty cool solution. However, it does create the potential for a new problem. And I'm going to use an example from not from cyber risk management, but from another area of cyber here, and talk about SIMs for a minute, right? So security information and event management platforms like a Splunk. SIMs can ingest any number of telemetry sources that you want to send to it, do some tuning, looking for indicators of compromise, and then spit out a bunch of results in the format of alerts that need to be looked at by human analysts to determine whether it's really something that we need to be focused on, or whether it's just kind of a false positive or some additional noise that we can just dismiss and not have to worry about too much. Risk teams versus SOC teams, right? Security operations analysts, for instance, aren't necessarily accustomed to receiving a whole bunch of alerts in real time that controls are falling out of compliance or that risk may be impacted. Typically, the way that this works up until this point is assessment season happens. Maybe it's done once a year or something, or based on a compliance requirement. You go through, you do your assessments on spreadsheets, you apply some analysis to it, which can take some time, especially if you're trying to compile the results of multiple assessments together and to get some graphics or dashboards together for leaders. And then by the time you're presenting that information, frankly, some of that is already out of date. What we're enabling the ability to do now is to receive that type of information in near real time, whether those integrations are run on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, on a monthly basis, whatever the cadence is that's expected. And then anytime we receive notification that a control that's associated with a risk has fallen out of compliance, an individual is going to receive a notification. So we have to give a little bit of thought to that and how we're going to structure some type of operations that's going to enable analysts on the risk side to be able to receive those alerts, make sense out of them, run them up the proper chain of command to determine what needs to be done about that. Because always keeping in mind that risk tolerance and the decision about what to do with risk, it really doesn't fall on analysts, right, or cybersecurity teams. That's really a leadership function. They need to understand and determine whether a risk is acceptable, whether they're going to just kind of accept it or not. I think for that example there, we could take something outside of cyber. Let's say natural disasters, right? There's a lot of concern out there about climate change and rising sea levels, and maybe there are going to be risks that we're receiving information from different sources letting us know that this is something that we may be an issue for us in 10 years or 20 years that might impact decisions that leaders make about where to put additional office space or physical plants or manufacturing facilities. Maybe they want to move it to another part of the country where isn't going to be quite as susceptible to sea level rise or something like that. So in some ways, the one of the major differences between a risk operations team like this and a security operations team is that I think with security, everyone's typically on the same page when something bad happens. If there's a denial of service attack, if your endpoints are all getting locked up by ransomware, everyone's pretty aligned that we need to do something right now and provide the resources to be able to, restore back to a point of normalcy, right, where we can get back to typical business operations as usual. As it pertains to risk, certainly some things are going to need to be acted on right away, but there may also be things that are kind of leading indicators of things that the business just needs to be aware of that we may not need to take action on today, but that needs to inform decisions going forward. So with that, I'm going to move forward to kind of the blueprint that we have for this. Many organizations, we've either bought or built a security operations center. So we have a little bit of a blueprint for how a risk operations center might look. We understand the expense that comes along with that. It's quite an expensive thing to build yourself, right? You have to consider the infrastructure for it. You have to consider the team members who are going to staff it. You need some redundancy because people are out sick or they take vacations. So building a security operations center, anyone who's been a part of that knows it's a multi-million-dollar investment to build something like that. So but we can look to that structure there and glean some insights into what a risk operations center may look like based on successes or failures, frankly, that we've had in putting together security operations centers. So some thoughts here on how to operationalize a ROC. And I do want to call out again that this is definitely a future-looking concept. There are examples of risk operations center that are out there, but they tend to focus more on financial risks. So some of the larger financial institutions, think the big banks and the credit card issuers like Visa and MasterCard, they typically have risk operations centers, but they're not really focused on cyber. For most organizations considering something like this, I mean, the first thing you'd need to do would be to have that system of record in place such that you're able to organize all of your risks and associate those controls and make sure that you're receiving the appropriate telemetry to understand what your posture looks like in real time. Once you have that set up, and maybe you're starting to notice that the alerting coming off of it is maybe causing some fatigue in your analyst team, it might be time to start thinking about how to operationalize a risk operations center. And one of the first places that I usually start with newer concepts or newer solutions is this something that we want to build, or is it something that we want to buy? I know I've had conversations both with some of our larger customers and really thought leaders in the space who are conceptualizing what this is going to look like in their own organizations going forward. But that's probably the higher level, the maximum level of maturity organizations that are out there. I think for the vast majority of organizations, taking a look at outsourcing opportunities may be probably the place to start. One challenge with outsourcing, though, is this next bullet point. Remember that the stakeholders for a ROC and a SOC are going to be very different, right? For the example that I gave earlier about everyone being aligned on a security incident versus maybe needing to get buy-in from executives or other stakeholders in the organization. So you'd need to make sure, if you're going to outsource a function like this, that outsourced organization does have a chain of command to get to the people in your company who can make those types of decisions. That may or may not be a feasible thing with a third party. So, something to keep in mind or maybe start thinking about as we move towards these type of solutions in the future. Which brings us to the next point around leadership and functional roles within a risk operations center. Leadership within a ROC would definitely need to be an individual who has access to those correct decision makers, someone who has the ability to speak in a business language about risk concepts in cyber. I will make the point in another slide here that this doesn't necessarily apply only to cyber. That's just the use case that I am most familiar with and CyberSane is most concerned with. But it would apply really, I think, across the board in enterprise risk management. But in any event, the at least the leadership of the Risk Operations Center would have to have those relationships with business stakeholders and leaders to be able to make the case for what's happening, what the timeline is, what the exposure looks like, and what some of the suggested remediation might look like. Always with risk management, we're looking towards buying down the risk to the extent that it's reasonable and doable. If we understand that we have a risk that's going to cost us $10 million, but the solution to buy that down is going to cost $20 million, probably doesn't make sense to do. If it's the other way around, it might be a good investment for the business overall. We need to make sure that we're communicating in that type of terminology with leadership. Which leads us to infrastructure and processes as well. So, you'd want to think through things like, is this going to be a 24/7 type of function, or is this something that we can just get through with regular business hours? Where is this rock going to be located? Can we put it in a geographic area if we're a multinational company, for instance, that has a relatively lower cost of labor? Or because of the importance of access to certain leadership, do we need to have it in our headquarters in New York City where people cost a lot of money? So those types of things would need to, be thought through, I think, ahead of time as well. And then obviously the key platforms and solutions. So similar to a security operations center, you're going to need that system of record. CyberStrong is a great option for that. But there's other ancillary things as well, ticketing systems and, any type of redundancy that you need to make sure operations can continue in times of a crisis. All that kind of stuff would need to be thought about a little bit beforehand there as well. So I called this out a little bit before, but I did want to just touch for a minute here on largely what I've presented has been the use case for a risk operations center for cybersecurity related risks. Obviously, this is a concept that can be applied across enterprise risks. I have some non-IT risk examples over there to the right on the slide here. We can think about things like natural disasters or, diseases, pandemics, things that are going to affect health and safety, also operational risk, strategic, reputational risk. One of the crossovers there for something like a reputational risk might be, there's been examples of executives at certain companies that make certain statements in public forums, or maybe they donate a lot of money to a PAC that is unpopular for some other people, and then that brings the hacktivist types out there, and maybe there's risks that are associated with that. So there's definitely going to be some crossover with all of these things. I mean, as we saw with the pandemic, even though that typically would have been characterized as a health and safety risk, it really affected a lot of IT operations, having to get people working from home really quickly, and all the, as we've seen, the issues that came out of that. IT is going to be involved in all this stuff, but definitely makes sense to talk to other risk leaders within the organization to kind of socialize the idea and see if they think that having a structure like a risk operations center would be helpful for their use cases as well. So that brings us to the end of the talk here. As I mentioned at the beginning, we at CyberSane we are putting together a ROC implementation guide that goes into some level of detail greater than I've been able to present here in a 25-30 minute presentation. If anyone is interested in that or would like to take a look at it, feel free to send an email to info@cybersane.io. And as soon as that is ready to go, we'll be happy to send it out there. Obviously, we'd be happy to talk to anybody out there in the audience as well who's just wants to maybe talk a little bit more about the conversations that we've had and some of the trends that we're seeing in the market as organizations prepare for kind of this next level of centralizing cyber risk management. So thanks again to everybody for joining. Really appreciate it. I hope you're enjoying the conference. There's been some amazing content here. Love the open source contributions from folks that are presenting, and for all of you who are attending, taking time out of your busy schedules to spend some time with us and our speakers. So thank you very much. If there's any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and I'll do my best to answer. So there's a question from Russell here. How do you know the telemetry sources are right? Do you have an oversight control for them without a human factor? So that's a good point. There's a process-wise, there's a step in between just connecting telemetry and associating it with controls. I touched on it a little bit with my comment about business logic. But there is some work that goes into doing this, right? My example about the vulnerability scans and defining what's going to make a pass or a fail for vulnerability scans, whether it's the criticality, the frequency, etc. That's also probably going to depend on the language of the framework that you're working with. One framework might just be asking, are you doing vulnerability scans on a regular cadence? Let's say if you're taking a look at or you're just using maybe the subcategories from the CSF, but if you're using the informative references and you're trying to get a little bit deeper, it's going to ask, what are you doing with those vulnerabilities once they've been identified? You have a process to track them through remediation. So you definitely need to go through and take a look at the individual control set, and that's going to vary organization to organization based on your requirements. I hope that answers your question. All right. Well, thanks again for joining. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or would like to continue the conversation.